What's going on, guys? I am super excited for this project. Dovetailed keepsake chest, mitered dovetails in the bottom to conceal a groove, made out of cherry. Here we go. Length is 16 inches and depth is 9 inches. Most people cross-cutting by hand are going to leave the board flat on the bench top overhanging the end or use a separate saw bench. This allows them to cut at a low angle to the face of the board with a line on it and get a straight cut. I like to cut down the line. It's better practice, better carryover for joinery cuts such as dovetails and tenons. If you need a little extra practice tracing a line with the saw, rough crosscuts are a great place to get some extra reps. The cabinet maker's triangle keeps me oriented throughout the project. I use a straight edge to identify the high spots, to then plane a flat and true face on the board. Next, I'm just going to work down the two high corners and the center of the board with the scrub plane. I follow that up with my jack plane. Paraffin wax makes the plane feel half the weight, and the extra width of the joiner plane blade is going to give this a very flat face. Winding sticks magnify twist, and I only use them as a last and final check. Kind of like looking through a telescope for a star, you're not going to start with it all the way zoomed in, or something like that. I don't know, I've never used a telescope. I add a face mark for my true reference face, and then I begin planing a true edge. Mark the true edge. The same procedure is used for all other boards, checking with the straight edge. Gap of light in the center shows those are the two high corners. I then flatten with the joiner plane. Check with winding sticks. And plane a true edge. To thickness my boards, I take my marking gauge and set it to the thinnest board and trace that line around the perimeter of all the other boards. Work down to that line starting with the scrub plane. And finishing with the jack plane. Once the boards have a true face, true edge, and they're thicknessed, it's time to take them to final length. And I'm going to go with a number 4 and also a block plane. By sharing the workload between the two, I can finish all this end grain without sharpening. And I work like this until the boards are exactly the same length. The last step for stock prep is to get to final width, and so I set my combination square to the most narrow board and mark a little dot on both ends, use my straight edge, give me a line, and I plane down to that line. I make sure the first board is perfect, and then I use that as a reference board to check all the other boards against. A crack in a few of these boards is really going to need to be reinforced with epoxy. Sometimes I use 5-minute epoxy in a pinch for things like I need to move the screw hole in a hinge or something like that. But for those really thin cracks, you need a slow setting epoxy. It's going to be more watery and it's going to seep down into those cracks all the way. 5-minute epoxy won't penetrate deep enough into a thin little crack like that. I just put it on and jab the cracks with the tip of a toothpick, and that helps break the surface tension. Mark the baselines using a square and a knife or a cutting gauge. For the mitered dovetail with concealed groove, I know I want at least 1/4 of an inch below the groove. The groove is going to be either 3/16 or 1/4 of an inch. I ended up going with 1/4 of an inch. And I want at least 1/8 of an inch of wiggle room. That's going to be the bottom of the half tail. So I'll mark that up. I then imagine that line is the end of the board, so I mark my half pins like normal and mark out the dovetails like normal. Cut down all the tail lines with a dovetail saw. Remove the waste with either a coping saw or a chisel. This was my first time to try removing waste with a coping saw, and I gotta say I really liked it. Then just chop out what's left. Coping to about 1/16 of an inch above the baseline seems to be about the sweet spot, but that's easier said than done. I chop about halfway, then flip, chop halfway from the other side. I was surprised at how clean this turned out. Very little cleanup afterwards. No backer block because I'm just a friggin' daredevil. Saw off the half pin, try not to cut past the baseline. A pencil line ensures the miters don't get cut in the wrong direction. Anybody who's cut a picture frame by hand knows that miters can and will get cut in the wrong direction at times. Very important that the vertical pencil line is only drawn on the inside face that's going to be mitered. All the other marks are going to be on the outside, but if you mess this part up, then your project's going to end up an inch shorter. Pins are going to be cut the same way as the tails. Dovetail saw to cut down the line, and then coping saw to remove the waste. Flip the board around and very carefully cut down that last line where the vertical line was drawn on the inside face of the board. Then even more carefully cut down the miter, and the one end of the saw should be tracing down the baseline, the other end of the saw should just hit that corner. I actually marked that out with a knife, but I didn't show that in the video. And same procedure for the tailboard. Theoretically, it should fit together right off the saw just like dovetails, but that's not always the case, and for me, it's pretty much never the case. So I just trim it to a good fit using a sharp chisel. Test fit, pair, test fit, pair. Try to avoid pairing on the very outside of the miter unless you're absolutely sure that that's what's obstructing closure. I'm going to be using a plow plane to run some grooves through these boxes. They're going to be through grooves. That's pretty common for the hand tool grooving of the bottom of a box. Power tool users would probably just use a plunge router, and they could avoid doing the mitered dovetail altogether. You could definitely also do a stopped groove just using chisels. That would take a lot longer and the end result just wouldn't be as clean, but you could totally do that if you don't have a plow plane or if you just want to do a stopped groove. I'm setting my gauge to the keyhole pin of the lock, and I'll mark that on the center line of the board, and then I basically just fit the lock sort of like you would a hinge. You just recess all the parts. I don't show the end of boring the hole here because I actually blew through and said a word that I'm not trying to teach my kids. I use a square awl to mark the little dot in the center of each screw hole, and then I use the same square awl to drill a pilot hole. A coping saw and a 1/8 inch chisel makes quick work of the keyhole. And then just a quick test fit to make sure we're in business. Now on to make the bottom of the box. This is going to fit in the groove. I'm using pine. I like using pine. Its tools zip through it like a hot knife through butter. It's like you have woodworking superpowers. It'd be kind of a weird superpower, but whatever. And actually just really proud of myself for not cussing there. There's a 1/4 of an inch below the groove, and the groove is a 1/4 of an inch, so I need to thin this board to no thicker than a 1/2 of an inch unless I want it to look like the box is floating. I marked 2 lines, one at a 1/4 of an inch and one at a 1/16 of an inch past that. This makes sure that I plane the field at a low enough angle that it can go to the end of the groove, but the edge does not get too thin. This is called fielding a panel because you're literally planing a field around the edge of the panel or the board. Make sure that it fully seats in the groove. If it doesn't, panels can actually separate the joints of a frame or a box, and I've learned that the hard way more than once, because if you make that mistake, you won't find out for about 6 months to a year. Test fit the groove and then just trim off the parts that are obstructing the fit. When possible, I always like to do a full dry fit assembly. This will show if anything needs to be fixed up before I glue it. I also check inside corner to inside corner with a tape measure. If there's one side longer than the other, that usually indicates a problem with the baselines, and the long side will need to be hit with a mallet after glue up. Now I'm just trimming up. I've already glued it up, planed the dovetails. I used liquid hide glue, tried that for the first time, and I gotta say that stuff made the dovetails just slip together so well. I'm a convert. This stuff was awesome. And I really just wanted to try it because it's supposed to have a very long open time, which could help with, adjusting things as you're gluing up. I trim every edge to strengthen and soften the corners. And now I'm just going to hinge the lid to the box. With my hinges, I like to squish them in a vise and enlarge the countersink, makes them fit better. I hinge my lid to the box while it's still a nice, easy to work with rectangle, then I'll take it off and shape it. This box is going to have a planted lid. I absolutely love the look of planted lids. For this size box, I'm just using a solid piece of wood for the planted lid. I finished the hinge leaf recess with a router plane, and then I use that same router plane set to the same setting for the other hinge leaf recesses. Then again, I use my square awl to mark the hinge holes and drill a little pilot hole. Screw in brass screws and try to clock them if you can, but just don't snap off the heads. To shape the lid, I'm going to start with just beveling 3 of the corners. This is going to lighten the appearance of the top. Then just give it a very light round over, and that will soften the sharp edges. I absolutely love cherry. When you first plant it, it's like this soft pink color, and it gets darker and richer with age. I'm going to finish it with tried and true. It's basically a linseed oil and beeswax mixture. Sometimes I make my own mixture that's similar to that. I use tung oil and beeswax. I kind of think the ratio to make a copycat recipe with tung oil is something like 15 to 20 parts oil to 1 part beeswax. But I haven't nailed that down exactly, and it also kind of depends on the temperature. I really love tried and true original. Nothing compares to an oil wax finish for me. I was absolutely thrilled with how this project came out, and it was a couple of firsts for me. It's first time using liquid hide glue, which was awesome. Also my first time to use a coping saw to remove the waste on dovetails, believe it or not, and I think that's the way I'm going to go from here on out.